While shared meaning is the point of interpersonal communication, the reason why we're disclosing and having somebody disclose to us, there are certain barriers to shared meaning that make this sometimes difficult, if not impossible. And so I want to go over those barriers with you within this video. I'm calling these a terminal noise of communication and critical thinking. Most of these barriers are psychological in concepts, the way we think, and has to do with some pre-existing noise or voices, automatic attitudinal defaults that we might have. They deal with disconfirmation, indiscrimination, the barrier of allness, fact inference, confusion, polarization, and lastly, this concept of static evaluation. I'm going to go through all of these like I do, okay, starting with disconfirmation. Disconfirmation is probably one of the most popular, ubiquitous types of barriers that we have because it's the easiest one to do. It's the barrier of summarily ignoring somebody else. It's the disregard of another. We do this with people with whom we're afraid. We do this with people that we don't want to engage with. And what's interesting is we do this with the people who are the closest to us because in some sense we've gotten so used to their proximity, or we just don't care on the level that we used to in terms of engaging them in what's going on around us. Famous psychologist William James noted, no more fiendish punishment could be devised than that one would be turned loose in society and remain unnoticed by the members thereof. We see that constantly. We might disconfirm somebody out of fear because they're different from us. If you have ever sat on a bus and you had a Down syndrome individual sit next to you, what happened to your level of comfort? Or did you engage them, or were you disconfirmed? We do this for so many different reasons on so many different levels, to where it becomes caustic to the very idea of humanity in terms of what's going on. Not long ago, I was at the Student Union Center, and this is before how it looks now there at Dixie State University. I won't get into all the detail, but I had picked up a sandwich and a soda. I was on my way out. This was in the general store area there in the Student Union Center before the food court was added onto it. And there in that eating area by the general store was a place where you can get your ketchup and your mustard and your mayo and stuff for your burger, your fries or whatever, and then forks and napkins and that kind of thing. It was all laid out on a counter, and then people would go to the counter to take care of their stuff. Well, in front of the counter was a student. I'd seen her on campus, and she wasn't hard to miss because she was in a wheelchair, a powered wheelchair that she powered by puffing on a straw. Okay, so she was quadriplegic, and she cerebral palsy, I think, was the underlying diagnosis, which is unclear as well because that's just kind of a generic term. She didn't have the ability to control her head. Her head rested on two little pads, okay, so it wouldn't flop over. But unfortunately, while she was there in front of the condiments, her head fell off the support and had flopped over, and her airway was being occluded, meaning she couldn't breathe. And she was turning dusky. She was turning blue. And the only expressions that she had on her face was in her eyes. Her eyes were getting wider and wider. The longer it was while that she couldn't breathe. And to my dismay, I was about 15, 20 feet away as I was backing out the door, and I looked over and she caught my attention. To my dismay, were the other students around her who were kind of scooting around her chair as if it were kind of a speed bump in the way of getting ketchup for their french fries or mustard for their burger or whatever the case might be. Nobody made eye contact with her. They disconfirmed her because she was different. Not only because, well, they wouldn't even look beyond what the wheelchair had going on. Here was a student in the middle of at least a couple of dozen other students who was dying. And granted, not everybody has the background to go through and see the signs and diagnose perhaps that she wasn't breathing, but it was still in dismay that because of the first barrier in terms of her disability, that she wasn't confirmed even by recognizing her inability to go through and breathe. to end the story, I don't say this to pat myself on the back, but I stepped in and I put her head back up and I waited for her to start saturating more. And eventually her companion, who helps her out, joined us as well. And they happen to have supplemental oxygen with her chair to help her get going. And again, I realize this, but most of our disconfirmation comes from a fear of being different. It comes from a fear of maybe interceding or intervening. In this case, what if I did something wrong and I made it even worse for her and somehow broke her neck or whatever. We don't respond. We don't engage because of those types of fears that happen. Or maybe I didn't want to be seen as the goody two shoes kind of person, and so I didn't get involved on that level. Or which are all these reasons are really ridiculous when it comes to the concept of humanity and perhaps what we do to go through and engage on somebody. It's more comfortable for us to ignore somebody than it is to go through and make that exchange. And that's what I'm hoping changes maybe with our behavior through this. Now I'm going to treat each one of these as a disease, if you will, each one of these barriers. And then I'm going to introduce an antidote, a cure to that. And the cure to this one is easy. It's confirmation. It's simply engaging people. And we don't have to do it all the time, everywhere we go. It'll zap all of our energy. But at least to go through and make eye contact and confirm the presence of another human being. That's all it is, really, is, oh, you're there, I see you, I'm smiling, hi, I recognize you. To take that a step further and open up a verbal channel is even better. Maybe open up a nonverbal channel in terms of a handshake or a wave or something that way. Go through and create a bridge to shared meaning instead of a barrier. Next up is this concept of indiscrimination. You might know this as discrimination. And there are two different types of definitions here. They both result in the same thing, and that is when somebody gets ignored. Okay? Indiscrimination is when one focuses on classes of individuals and they fail to see their uniqueness and individuality. And we're seeing this now more than ever. We would like to think that as a result of civil rights or as a result of just the own advancement of the way we think, the way we treat each other, that we would get beyond this. But we're not. In fact, we're living in a country now where there's a ban on people who happen to look like this. And that is indiscrimination, and that's a barrier to arriving at shared meaning. This barrier results in the biggest communication mistake that we can make, and that is this concept of stereotyping. Indiscrimination and discrimination is the reason why we go through and stereotype. I'm hoping you're able to go through, you might want to hit pause and go through and read every single one of these, because chances are you, as a stereotype, might fit into one of these and might understand a little bit better what it means to be indiscriminated. The cure to this is this idea of consideration. It's the act of being thoughtfully kind. It's the act, like confirmation, going through and considering the value or the contribution of what somebody else might have here. To consider that they are not like what we've stereotyped them to be, and that they have differences that go through and make them truly unique and give them more value, rather than discounting them just based on what we've inferred about them. Which brings me to this concept of allness. Now, you're going to recognize that none of these are mutually exclusive. Okay, they bleed into each other, and there are certain ways where examples or anecdotes or the way we treat people where we go, oh, I see that you were being indiscriminate, or I was being indiscriminative, or I was being disconfirmative that way. Allness is one of the reasons why the others exist, is because we have a tendency to see somebody, we make certain assumptions about them, or we know one or two things, and then we think that's all there is to know about that person. This is Michael Brown. And this is the image that Michael Brown's mother gave to the press to use to identify Michael Brown after he was shot in a suburb of St. Louis by a police officer. And there's a reason why this is the image that his mother wanted the public to know Michael Brown by. Because in the time it took for that police shooting to be reported, to the time it took for the press to get a hold of Michael Brown's mom, Michael Brown was characterized as a thug. And we all know what a thug is. That's allness. When she arrived at the road where Michael Brown's body still laid, the first thing she expressed in her horror of finding her son there was that we just got him graduated from high school. Regardless of how you might feel in terms of this whole case, or maybe you don't know anything at all, and if you don't, you need to go back and Google this and be careful about the sources that you read. Make sure that they're vetted, make sure that they come from valid sources in order to get a better understanding of this shooting. The shooting is significant because really it became I don't know how to say this, it became the impetus, it opened the floodgates of other reported crimes of officer-involved shootings with black men. Okay, we hear about that. It pops up on our newsfeed. We see it in YouTube, or it comes in the traditional media on our news station about another person, Eric Garner, who's illegally selling cigarettes, who's tackled to the ground and who's suffocated and killed by police officers. We go, well, there must have been a reason. That's allness that kicks in and says, well, if they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, then I already know all there is to know about that person. Michael Brown was not a thug. The cure to allness is to never make those assumptions. It's that agreement to never assume. The next is this concept of fact-inference confusion, where we go through and we take some information that we might have on something and we fill in the gaps with our own imagination or our own assumptions and create what's called an inference. And so we think we know what the person's talking about. We think we know what the person's gone through when we don't really know the facts about that. The place where this is probably the most caustic is within relationships. To make assumptions based on inference instead of going through and asking each other for more information, for more intelligence, for more data, in order for us to be operating on something more factual instead of something that we're just coming to a conclusion about. The cure of this one's pretty straightforward. And yet most of us don't take the time or use the energy to go through and find out what that might be. And that, by definition, that level of disclosure is interpersonal communication. But we might be too afraid to find out the facts, or we might be we want to protect our own ideas that we've already conjured up about what might be happening. The facts would force us to go through and change our minds. We might be too stubborn just to do that. Intentional orientation is the act of actually applying a label to somebody else. This is a tendency to view people in terms of how they've been labeled, or we talk about their label instead of how they actually are. We do this all the time. It's a third-party labeling. So like if you come to me and ask me about a certain individual, if he's a good worker, and I slap this label and I say, well, he's really not that great of a worker. And now you are intentionally oriented to him, okay? You're not going to see him for what he might really be. You'll see him for how I have oriented you to be. Now, what's interesting is the burden here, okay? It doesn't fall on me telling you that he's probably not a good worker. The burden falls on you for having gone to a third party to figure out what this guy might actually be like. Recent research on human behavior of gossip indicates that this kind of going around somebody is a survival instinct. I talked about lying in a previous video. It's the same kind of application that we're getting into. This barrier happens on a primal level. It's one that seeks to preserve our self or to protect ourself. You've done this maybe with your parents. You've gone to a sibling wondering if it's okay to ask dad about something, right? And the sibling goes through and says, well, dad's not in a good mood right now, and labels what's going on. Or it might go through and say, well, dad's in a great mood, and that would be a wonderful time to go through and ask him for whatever. This goes both ways, this intentional orientation. We can label somebody very positively to somebody else, only for them to find out that maybe they aren't the person that they thought that they were talking to. These labels transmit on the backbone of rumor and are just as injurious as a direct insult. So the trick here is to not be intentional, okay? The cure is to go extensional. And that means to go directly to the source, eliminate the third party. Don't hold them liable, responsible for your perception of that person. Again, relationally, this is so important to go through and make sure we have shared meaning, that we don't go to somebody else to find out how our significant other might be doing. We go to that significant other. There's something sacred about that channel, about that communication that we have going on. We're living at a time in this country where we couldn't be more polarized. We have the left versus the right. Polarization is a fallacy of either or. It's a barrier of extremes. You either are or you're not. This is another easy barrier to default to because we only have to see another person in one of two ways. You either are or you're not. Or you either are or you're not. Are we that shallow? Are we that incapable of being able to figure out on our own, of being able to go through and ask critical questions? Do we not have the ability to realize that polarization pulls us away from a dichotomy? That everything really exists on some level. There's no such thing as a liberal, and there's no such thing as a conservative. I've never met one or the other. They're somewhere along that line in terms of their social and political and fiduciary values that are out there. But for us to go through and say, well, he's just a libtard, or to go through and say that they're just I don't know what a conservative derogative term would be. But to label somebody that way goes through and first off shows our own retardation in how we're thinking, okay? That we have not taken any kind of critical time to go through and assess and see what's going on. We're defaulting really to intentional orientation. We're just labeling people because it's easier to do that way. It's easier to see somebody as a polar opposite than it is to go through and see them on some kind of continuum. The cure to this is to look at the continuum, is to find that middle ground and realize that no matter how disparate we might be in terms of culture, in terms of our social standings, in terms of our financial standings, in terms of our family, in terms of our religious beliefs, no matter what, there's still something that we have in common. There's still some middle ground. I have circumnavigated this planet twice in my career as a filmmaker, and I've gone into cultures where I thought there was no possible way we could have anything in common, only to be proven wrong. We all have something there, and it might just be that underneath the skin, underneath the gender, besides the age, that we all bleed red, you know? The last one is this idea of static evaluation. And this is interesting. It seems like the older we get, the more prone we are to default to this concept of static evaluation. It means that static means unchanging, and evaluation is judgment. Okay, it's an unchanging judgment. This is a barrier that's influenced by the notion that we think people don't change. And this is subtly dangerous. Ask any parent who failed to see changes in their drug-addicted child. Okay? Or ask any teacher who overlooked the subtle tells of an escalating violent behavior. When we go through and we see somebody for the first time, this is the primacy recency effect, okay? We take a Polaroid of that individual, and then we carry that Polaroid around with us psychologically, okay? So the next time we see them, we pull out that Polaroid and we go through, oh yeah, I remember you. Okay, this is who you are. And we don't give them the benefit of the doubt that they've changed, when in fact they have. The temporal context alone is an agent for change. If you get into a fight with your significant other in the morning and the two of you go off your separate ways, you go to work or school and they go to work or school, and they have a whole day to come of experiences, and then they come back together, you come back together at the end of the day, is it realistic for you to go through and look at that person, statically evaluating them, they might still be upset with you? or still bothered by the notion that got you to fighting to begin with, or for you, in fact, to feel the same way about them. It's impossible. But we do this on a regular basis, and that goes through and impedes our ability to find some kind of shared meaning because we're still assuming that they still feel the same way that we did in the morning when we left. And that's not true. Relationships change. They change from moment to moment, but they're like that minute hand on the clock. We don't see it moving, right? We don't pay a whole lot of attention to that. We get into a routine. Routines go through and undermine our ability to be astonished. And if we paid more attention to the changes that happen, even over the course of an hour, our astonishment leads us more into shared meaning. The cure to this one is observation. It's simply to take off the blinders and gather as much new data, as much new intelligence as we can. And the word intelligence sounds a little creepy, but it's to go through and find out more cues as to what this person might be feeling. The way we do that is by talking to them. Is by asking for disclosure. It's by disclosing ourselves. It's encouraging everything that we've talked about in terms of active listening, passive listening. These cures lead to a conclusion not of our inability to reach shared meaning, but for us to go through and be able to find some common ground, some common sense in how we're communicating with each other. If you haven't watched the video on shared meaning before this one, you need to make sure that you watch that one. All right? Talk to you later.